Okay, hey, we're going to come back for part two here of chapter one, and we're going to look at the Native American cultures in North America. And so when we're looking at these, right, like you look at, I don't know, the societies or the cultures that develop in Mesoamerica. You have the Olmec, you have the Mayans, you have the Amazon, the Aztecs, or even into Latin America, or into South America, you have the Incas. And what you see there is you have this restriction of land in Mesoamerica, where the Mexican isthmus gets Latin American isthmus gets much smaller, and it is as the landmass shrinks, people have to get along. Or you go to the Andes Mountains and on the west coast of Colombia and Peru, Chile and Peru, and the Incas have to work together because there's only so much land available to them. That's not necessarily the case in North America, and so you don't see these large scale societies. Although there are some factors of large scale societies that are going to be present, but it's not as developed or as advanced as other places, right? The population in North America is much more spread out. You have a hunter and gatherer society that truly is hunting and gathering. There's some agriculture where you're going to lay down, spread seeds around in the spring, and then you're gonna follow the herds. You're gonna follow the migration of animals, and then hopefully come back to that original location of the planting in the late summer, early fall, and harvest. So it's not agriculture in the modern sense where you're going to plant, you're going to till, and you're going to weed, and you're going to irrigate, all those types of things. Now there are going to be instances of irrigation and whatnot, but things are going to be a little bit different, I suppose. The other thing to keep in mind is that all this movement is going to be done on foot. There are no horses, there's no large mammals in the Americas um, before the Spanish reintroduced them in 1500. I say reintroduced because originally over the Bering Strait, the Bering Land Bridge, there are large mammals that come across. There are even horse-like creatures that come across to North America and to Mesoamerica, but they all die out uh, with the melting of the glaciers and the end of the ice age and that. And so we go through this period where there's not, um, yeah, horses aren't available, and so we don't have that. So the first society we're going to look at is in the American Southwest. This is the Pueblo Society. It's going to exist before the turn of the millennium, like 150 BCE to 1450 CE. Um, and so like it's when the Spanish show up, the Pueblo societies in decline to begin with, and so you have that. They're going to be a desert people, so you're going to have irrigation systems that are set up. That I would say that this is probably the most advanced farming areas of the Americas, of the North American area. They're going to grow the same types of corn. They're going to grow the same types of crop and corn and beans and squash. And they're going to live in cities, and so you'll have cities, and then they'll go out places to farm. And these cities are going to have adobe huts in which a whole family will live together. There'll be multiple rooms, very similar to modern day apartments that we see. An offshoot of the Pueblo, they're still part of that Pueblo group, are the Anasazi, and they're going to build their cities in cliffs. Archaeologists believe that this was done for protection. Um, and so, at night when it was time to, go to bed, everybody would come into the city and you'd pull up the ladder and you could prevent people from coming in, protect yourself from outside, animals or the aggression of other tribes. This Pueblo community was held together by a loose network of roads, very similar to the Incas. And somewhere around 1450, the Pueblo began to abandon their cities, and they split off from a larger society into smaller groups. And so by the time the Spanish stumble into them in the 1450s, early, well, 1450s, in the 1500s. The Pueblos are in decline. The second group we're going to look at is the Native Americans that are going to settle in the Ohio River region, Ohio River Valley region. This would be like the modern Midwest. You're going to be talking about Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, um, parts of Pittsburgh, right? This is going to be the Hopewell Indians, the Hopewell culture, right? Or sometimes they're referred to as the mound builders. They're going to be most prevalent from around the year 0 to about 400 CE. They're going to live in small villages. They're going to have a small agriculture, but mostly it's going to be hunting, fishing, those types of things. But they're going one of the things that are going to really kind of captivate the future generations, historians, and archaeologists are what the Hopewell are going to do. They're going to build mounds. They're going to build huge mounds in all types of different shapes. It's theorized that maybe possibly these mounds could have been like calendars, similar to like Stonehenge, something along those lines, where you can track the seasons. Um, but it's not necessarily even that, but like they're like almost like inside these mounds, once they start to excavate them, they find artifacts, and they're almost like garbage dumps. But then they're formed into different shapes, and so like one of the most famous is Serpent Mound, which is outside of Cincinnati, Ohio. And so these people have that, and they also have this pretty extensive trade networks. You find artifacts that were produced by the Hopewells well into Canada, and again into the American Southwest and into the American South. And so we have that a little bit further west and south into the Mississippi River. You're going to see the Chahoka, which is the largest of these Native American cultures in North America. We have the Chahoka Mountains, which are right outside of St. Louis. They're right off of I-70. If anybody's ever driving down I-70, you'll see the signs for them. You can stop and look. There's a picture there on the bottom right. And these mounds are, no, they're are just earthen pyramids. And so you have those. It's believed that possibly some of the nobility or the more important members of society would have lived on those mounds, while everybody else would have lived in small farming areas around, and then followed herds. You also have the Native Americans in the Eastern Woodlands. And there's other groups of Native Americans. We're going to have Native Americans in the Pacific Northwest. You're going to have Native Americans in the Delta regions of the deep South, not even the Mississippi Delta, but into Alabama and Georgia and those types of places. But these are just giving you kind of a overview of what's here, just to kind of drill into this idea that there was Columbus finds America, right? Stumbles into the New World, but he doesn't discover it. There are people living here, right? There's societies, and there's towns, and there's culture, and there's all these things happening. You see this. I would argue, if I was and I'm not an archaeologist and I'm not an anthropologist at all, but I would say that if you're going to see, if you would see the development of an intricate North American Native society, the place that it would happen is up here in the Pacific, in the Eastern Woodlands, which would be the New England states. And I think the reason for that is you can obviously see the constriction of land. And so your Native American tribes that live in what's going to become the New England colonies, or even into the middle colonies in New York and Pennsylvania, the land shrinks up, and you have to get along. And so this is where you're going to see the Iroquois, which is the combination of 5 different Native American tribes that are going to come together and live under common rule. And so I think that's the start of what could have blossomed into something that the Europeans would have recognized as society. Before you get there, there's tribal warfare that's pretty commonplace. Most of the hunting, or most of the fighting is over hunting grounds and the rights to hunt different areas. I think uh, the way that sounds is it almost sounds like there's private ownership of those hunting grounds, but that's not necessarily the case. It's just the right to hunt those. These tribes in the Northeast are actually led by men, or the male chiefs, but women are going to play a very, very important role. In fact, women are going to have rights in these Native American cultures that the European women that come over, afterwards, don't have. And some historians will argue that some of the problems, the warfare that breaks out between the European settlers and the Native Americans is because of this tension, a gender tension, where the women that are coming over from Europe, and they begin to question, hey, why can't I have these similar types of rights, right? There's shared responsibility in child raising. Big thing though is there's no concept of private ownership of land, right? So tribes could hunt, and they had a right to hunt those areas, but they didn't necessarily own that land. And so when the Europeans come over and try to buy land, there's this almost there's almost this miscommunication or misunderstanding of what it means. Personal possessions were prevalent, except it wasn't like, your hut belonged solely to you or your house belonged solely to you. Typically, your personal possessions belong exist. The extent of those would be what you made by hand or what you could carry on your back. So your weapons, your handmade tools, those types of things, right? And so that's the North American, Native American culture that we're dealing with at time of European contact. The third and final group that's going to be brought into this cultural exchange are going to come in unwillingly, and these are going to be the individuals that are going to be enslaved from Africa. And so when we look at Western Africa, that's where most of the enslaved people are going to be transported from. You can see here on the pictures. You're dealing with a society that values a tribal existence, right? So most of the people that are living in West Africa are going to come from a relatively small tribal village, right? And so their way of thinking, the way of thinking of these people or these tribes, is that the tribe is the most important thing, and then there's everything else outside of the tribe. And so it's the tribe basically against the world, right? Um, and so you have this, but you do have large empires that exist in West Africa before the Europeans show up. By 750, you have the Empire of Ghana, which grows relatively rich by taxing salt that passes through North Africa or West Africa to the Mediterranean, right? And eventually, they're going to convert to Islam as Islam spreads out of the Middle East into West Africa. And in fact, probably arguably one of the most wealthiest individuals ever to live is a guy by the name of Mansu Musa, who was the head of the Mali Empire. Um, and Mali's takes over for Guyana, and he makes his wealth through taxation, right? But he's so rich, and there's so much gold wealth in Mali that when Mansu Musa takes his pilgrimage to the Holy Land, he's Islamic, so he's Muslim, so he's going to take his Hajj to Mecca. Historians can actually track his route by looking at the inflated prices of goods, because he is on this caravan that takes, I think, 22 days for all the camels, once the camels appear on the horizon, for the last camel to leave the horizon. And he's handed out wealth to the poor. And so once all these poor people get money, of course, the prices go up. And so you see a huge amount of inflation during this time frame. Okay, so we talked earlier about the fact that the West Africans are going to enter this this agreement or this exchange unwillingly, and they're going to come into it through this idea of slavery. And so slavery is practiced in Africa and West Africa, much like slavery is practiced throughout the rest of the world. There's a long history of slavery in the Roman Empire. The Greeks had slaves. You're going to have slaves in Viking culture. Um, but what you're going to see, it's going to come. What's going to be different about this type of slavery is one, you're going to have this idea of every slave being part of this chattel system of slavery, where slaves become property. Chattel system slavery, chattel slaves have existed before this period of time, but never every single slave in society. And then you're also going to see this movement of slaves, of the slaves from their homeland to a place that's so far away, and that's why this type of slavery that's going to be practiced in the New World is going to be part of something. This new movement of slavery is going to be called the transatlantic slave trade. So we're going to put enslaved Africans on boats, and we're going to transport them across the Atlantic Ocean, right? And so we can see that, and so you know the slave trade it is going to exist in Africa well before the Europeans show up or the Portuguese show up. But once the Portuguese begin to settle the Canary Islands off the west coast of Africa, they begin to trade guns for individuals. Um, in West Africa, and they start to bring the enslaved onto those sugar plantation islands, those sugar islands, those Canary Islands, to produce sugar that's in demand in Europe, right? And so we do that. We talk about that. In the New World, we're in the need of a new labor force, and this is because of um, the mass depopulation that's going to follow the European contact of Europe. Europe's going to show up with, the flu or the small yellow fever or whatever, and it's going to kill off huge portions of the Native American population. And so the Europeans are seeing this new land, specifically in the Caribbean, as places to grow sugar. Sugar is the driving force of the economy during this time frame, and with the Native American population being basically zero, um, the Europeans are going to look towards Africa as a way to meet those labor needs. To give you an example, the island of Hispaniola, which is one of the islands that Columbus visited on his first trip to America, um, 5 years after Columbus's first contact with the island of Hispaniola, 99% of that island's native population was dead from European diseases, right? Europe also has a little bit of a problem enslaving other Christians. Europe is a Christian idea, Christian. That's what we're going to refer to as Christendom, this Christian area. They don't want to enslave other Christians, and so Africa during this time frame is either primitive. I don't like that word, but tribal religions, or they had converted to Islam, and so that opens up that kind of takes the guilt off of the Europeans in that respect, right? And we talked about the fact that sugar is going to really drive this slave trade and demand for enslaved labor. Sugar cane and rice, both are very, very labor intensive. Both of them, both sugar cane and rice, typically grow in very hot, muggy, humid climates, moist climates. And so mosquitoes are going to be a problem. And so, bloodborne diseases are going to get transferred relatively easily. And so Europeans had exposed some Africans to Europeans and Africans have exposure to each other's diseases by this point. And so you have some natural built-in immunities to those, but slaves that are going to die either from overwork or malnutrition or disease are going to be replaced by new slaves that are going to be brought in um, through this African slave trade that Europe is going to put in place to meet their labor needs in the New World. Okay. And the English colonies, and this is kind of interesting to begin with. At least the English colonies first met their labor needs with indentured servants, and we're going to come back and we're going to talk about indentured servants ad nauseum here in a couple chapters. But typically, the indentured servant would come over and work for 5 or 7 years. They're typically a poor um, laborer from England or from Ireland or from Europe someplace, right? They would come over, they would work for someone that was relatively wealthy. They could pay their voyage, pay for room and board for five to 7 years, and then at that point they would be freed to live a free life in the New World. As cash crops become more dominant in the South, like tobacco to begin with, rice, indigo. And we start to see some indentured servant rebellions. You see a shift away from indentured servants into slavery, and so slavery becomes, really gets its hooks into the New World at that point and into North America. Um, Interestingly enough, slavery in the New World is based on race. Not necessarily saying that every black person is going to be a slave, but there's no white slaves in America. There's indentured servants, right? So that's a difference also of the types of slavery that are going to be practiced in the New World versus the ancient world. In ancient Greece, you could have a Greek that could own an African. You could have a Greek that could own a European. You could have a Greek that would own another Greek, right? You could even have a African that would own a Greek slave. Like, the race wasn't part of that equation in slavery. In the New World, it is, and so that's a different variable when we're looking at that. And that's going to bring us to the end of chapter 1. So hopefully you guys, I didn't bore you to sleep, and you can hang around for chapter 2, and I will see you then. Bye bye.